The evening air inside the Grand Hotel was thick with perfume, polished wood, and the laughter of wealthy guests who had come for dinner and music. Chandeliers glittered above, their crystals scattering light across the room like stars, while polished shoes clicked against the marble floors. Waiters in pressed white shirts carried silver trays, weaving between tables draped in linen. At the far edge of the hall, away from the glamour and chatter, a janitor moved quietly with his mop and bucket. His uniform was old, faded, and damp from hours of scrubbing floors. Every stroke of the mop echoed his tired rhythm, a life of long days and small wages. Earlier that evening, before the crowd had fully settled, he had gathered the courage to approach the maitre d'. With his cap in hand and a voice low but hopeful, he asked, "Sir, may I have a small plate of food? I could mop extra tonight." His words trembled, as if he were asking for too much. Before he could finish, a sharp laugh cut through his sentence. A group of guests, overhearing him, burst into mockery. "A mop for a meal." One man scoffed, lifting his wine glass high. "Perhaps he thinks scrubbing our shoes will earn him dessert." Another added, "This is no soup kitchen, old man." Their laughter rang across the tables, echoing louder than the violinists in the corner. The janitor's face flushed, his hands tightening around the wooden handle of his mop. He lowered his eyes, not daring to look at them. He had lived too many years of humiliation to fight back now. Hunger clawed at his stomach, yet pride kept him from begging further. He stepped back silently, returning to the corners where shadows hid him best. Around him, the hall sparkled with wealth, golden cutlery, crystal glasses, roasted meats sending their scent through the air, yet he remained invisible. His life was measured in quiet labor, in rooms where no one applauded, in long nights where he swept away the remnants of other people's celebrations. Still, deep within, there was something the laughter couldn't crush, a small ember of memory he carried with him. But for now, he simply bowed his head, dipped the mop once more into the bucket, and let the echo of their laughter dissolve into the silence of his work. The sound of silverware clinking against porcelain filled the air, blending with bursts of chatter and the rustle of silk gowns as the hotel's elite dined in style. But beneath the golden glow of chandeliers, an unexpected problem surfaced. The piano, meant to carry the soul of the evening, stood silent in the corner. The musician who had been booked to play had cancelled last minute, leaving only the glossy black instrument as a decorative piece. The maitre d' paced with quick, sharp steps, his face pale with frustration. He knew that silence was dangerous, guests had not paid for quiet. They expected music, refinement, the soft thread of melodies to stitch the night together. Already, murmurs of discontent spread from table to table. "What's wrong with the entertainment?" one man asked, dabbing at his lips with a silk napkin. A woman in a glittering gown complained to her companion, "Imagine, such a prestigious hotel, and no music. Disgraceful." The maitre d' pinched the bridge of his nose, searching for solutions but finding none. At the far side of the room, the janitor paused, his mop stilled in his hands. He had been listening, heart tightening with every word about the missing pianist. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure if he dared to speak. But hunger sharpened his courage, and something deeper stirred within him, something he had buried long ago. Slowly, he stepped forward, approaching the maitre d' with his cap in hand. His voice was low, almost apologetic, but steady. "If I may, sir, I could play just one song, perhaps, in exchange for a meal." The maitre d' blinked at him, his face twisting in disbelief. "You?" His sharp laugh drew the attention of nearby guests, who quickly turned their eyes to the scene. "You can't be serious. A janitor, a pianist." His words were laced with mockery, but before the janitor could answer, one of the guests chimed in. "Oh, this I must see," the man said, smirking, swirling the wine in his glass. "The man can barely mop. Now he thinks he's Mozart." Another guest, a woman dripping in jewels, leaned forward and added with a scoff, "Perhaps he believes scrubbing keys is the same as playing them." The laughter that followed was harsh, echoing like knives in the janitor's ears. His face warmed with shame, but he didn't retreat. He stood silently, shoulders squared, eyes steady, not pleading, but patient. Then, with a small breath, he repeated his request. "Please, just one chance." The maitre d' looked around the room. Guests were amused, some even entertained by the thought of seeing him humiliated. The whispers grew louder, this was theater now, a sideshow to their elegant meal. With an exaggerated sigh and a roll of his eyes, the maitre d' waved his hand dismissively. Fine, sit. Show us your so-called talent. But remember, this is a hotel of dignity. Do not embarrass yourself further. The janitor nodded once, calm despite the derision. He felt their laughter behind him as he walked slowly toward the piano, each step heavier than the last. His uniform was wrinkled, his shoes scuffed, and his hands still smelled faintly of bleach. The instrument gleamed like an untouchable jewel, its surface polished to perfection. For a brief moment, as he approached the bench, the janitor caught his reflection on the piano's lid, a tired man, lined by years of hardship, carrying the weight of invisibility. He sat down quietly, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the black and white keys that seemed to stretch like a path before him. Around the room, guests whispered and chuckled, already anticipating his failure. Some leaned back in their chairs, wine glasses in hand, ready to be amused. To them, it was a passing entertainment, a joke at the expense of a man beneath their notice. But to the janitor, this was not mockery, it was a moment he had been waiting for his whole life, a chance to reclaim a part of himself no mop could ever wash away. The janitor's hands trembled slightly as he settled onto the piano bench. For years, those hands had known only the feel of wooden mop handles, buckets of water, and the sting of cleaning chemicals. The keys before him looked foreign at first glance, yet familiar, like the face of an old friend he had not seen in decades. He took in a slow breath, trying to calm the rush of nerves running through his chest. Behind him, the audience of diners whispered and chuckled, their voices carrying a cruel edge. "This will be good," one man muttered, smirking as if preparing to witness a circus act. A woman fanned herself lazily, her bracelets jingling as she said, "I hope he doesn't break the instrument." Their words pressed against his back like a wall, but the janitor kept his gaze on the black and white keys. When his fingers touched the piano, the room hushed slightly, not out of respect, but curiosity. They expected sour notes, clumsy pounding, perhaps even embarrassment that would confirm their prejudices. Instead, what emerged was a single soft chord, tender yet firm, like the opening of a story. His fingers moved again, this time weaving several notes together. Then, without hesitation, he let his hands find their rhythm, gliding across the keyboard with a fluency that stunned the hall. The sound rose, clear and resonant, filling every corner of the grand dining room. The laughter evaporated, forks stilled, glasses lowered, heads turned as the melody unfurled, gentle at first, then swelling with power. It was not just music, it was confession. Each note seemed to carry a piece of the man's life, the sorrow of lost opportunities, the ache of long-forgotten dreams, the quiet strength of survival. His hands, once rough from endless labor, now danced with grace, coaxing emotions from the instrument that no one expected. The piano responded to him as if it remembered him, as if it had been waiting for him all along. Guests who had scoffed leaned forward now, their eyes wide, their bodies leaning toward the source of the sound. Couples stopped mid-conversation, captivated. A few closed their eyes, allowing the melody to wash over them. The janitor no longer noticed the glittering gowns or the sharp suits. He was no longer in a dining hall filled with strangers. In his mind, he was back in a small church where, as a boy, he had first learned to play. He saw his younger self, dreaming of stages and audiences that would one day hear his gift. He saw his parents, proud and hopeful, before life's hardships had forced him away from music and into survival. Each keystroke became a thread, stitching together the fragments of who he once was and who he could still be. The piece grew in intensity, his hands moving faster, effortlessly blending sorrow with triumph. It was as if he was telling the story of his entire life in one performance. Notes rose like questions, then fell like answers. The melody carried both grief and beauty, speaking a universal language that even the wealthiest in the room could not ignore. A man who had earlier mocked him found himself gripping his napkin tightly, eyes moist without understanding why. A woman who had dismissed him as just a janitor, now felt her throat tighten as the music touched something buried deep inside her. By the time the final passage arrived, the janitor's body leaned fully into the piano, pouring out every ounce of himself into the keys. His fingers struck the last note, letting it linger in the air like the final word of a prayer. Then silence fell. Absolute silence. Not a fork moved, not a whisper was heard. The entire hall sat frozen, as though no one dared to disturb the sacredness of what they had just witnessed. The janitor lifted his hands slowly, resting them in his lap. His chest rose and fell with exhaustion, yet his eyes were calm. For a brief moment, he feared their response. Would they laugh again, dismiss it as luck, return to their meals as though nothing had happened? But then, one person began to clap. Another followed. Soon the room erupted in thunderous applause, not polite or obligatory, but raw and genuine. People stood from their chairs, hands striking together with force, some even whistling or cheering. The same voices that had mocked him were now shouting his praise. He bowed his head, overcome with a mix of relief and disbelief. They had not just heard him play, they had heard him. His music had broken through the invisible walls that had hidden him all his life, reminding him that even under the stains of work clothes and the weight of poverty, his gift had never truly died. The applause thundered through the dining hall, echoing against the marble walls and shimmering chandeliers. For a moment, the janitor sat frozen at the piano bench, unsure if what he was hearing was real. His whole life he had been overlooked, ignored, treated as though he were invisible, and now an entire room stood on their feet for him. The sound of their clapping was not just noise, it was recognition, something he hadn't felt in decades. He lowered his head humbly, a small tear forming in the corner of his eye, though he quickly brushed it away. With the back of his rough hand, the maitre d', who had mocked him only moments earlier, stood stiffly at the edge of the room, his face pale with shame. He had expected laughter, humiliation, perhaps even pity for the janitor's failure. Instead, he had been proven wrong in the most spectacular way. For once, he was at a loss for words, unable to disguise his discomfort as the guests celebrated a man he had treated like dirt under his shoe. One of the wealthier patrons, a silver-haired man in a tailored suit, made his way to the piano. He placed a firm but gentle hand on the janitor's shoulder. "Sir," he said, his voice warm and steady, "you've given us more tonight than any scheduled performance ever could. You've reminded us what true music is, honest, from the heart. You don't need to mop floors for a meal. Tonight, you've earned far more than that." His words, sincere and clear, carried across the hall. Several guests nodded in agreement, murmuring affirmations. Almost immediately, plates of food were ordered to be brought for the janitor. Roasted meats, fresh bread, and bowls of steaming vegetables were laid before him at a table near the stage. For the first time in years, he sat not as a servant in the shadows but as an honored guest. The aroma of the meal filled his senses, making his empty stomach ache with gratitude. Yet as he ate slowly, savoring each bite, he realized the food, though precious, was not the greatest gift of the evening. It was the chance to be seen, to be valued, to let his forgotten dream breathe again. As he ate, offers began to pour in. A woman in a pearl necklace leaned forward eagerly. "Would you consider playing at my daughter's wedding next month? We'd be honored." Another guest, a young man with shining eyes, asked, "Do you give lessons?" "My son has been wanting to learn." Even the hotel manager, realizing the opportunity, cleared his throat and said, "Perhaps we could arrange for you to play here regularly. Our guests would certainly be delighted." The janitor listened, overwhelmed, his mind struggling to keep pace with the sudden flood of possibilities. For years, he had lived in silence, resigned to the role of the invisible worker. Music had been a dream he thought the world no longer wanted from him. Yet tonight, with a single song, everything had changed. He looked at his worn hands, the same ones that had scrubbed floors for so long, and now those hands had opened doors he thought were locked forever. The maitre d', at last, approached him, his pride clearly bruised. His voice wavered as he spoke. I underestimated you. Please accept my apology." The janitor looked at him for a long moment, then simply nodded. There was no anger in his eyes, only quiet dignity. He had no need for revenge, he had already proven himself in a way that words never could. As the evening drew on, the crowd slowly dispersed, still buzzing about the unexpected performance they had witnessed. Some promised to return, others whispered excitedly about telling friends and family of the janitor turned pianist. When the hall finally grew quiet again, the janitor remained seated at the piano, his hand resting gently on the keys. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to dream, not of meals or mops, but of music, of stages, of an audience that listened. He whispered softly to himself, almost like a vow, "Perhaps it's not too late." His reflection on the piano lid looked back at him, not just a tired man in a faded uniform, but an artist rediscovered. The janitor rose slowly, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He knew tomorrow he might still carry his mop and bucket, but tonight, he had reminded the world, and himself, that he was more than the work he did. He was a man with music inside him. And finally, the world had heard.